Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I'd like to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into the intuition of the heart. With all the craziness out there, with all the violence, with all the discontinuities and fake news and artificial intelligence and climate change, it's hard to know what's real. It's hard to know what the right pathway is. It's hard to set priorities. It's hard to know the deeper intuitions that in normal times are challenging enough to discern, but in chaotic times are both more available to us, but also more challenging to connect with. So today we're just going to step back and we're going to invite someone who's been on Humanity Rising a number of times, Rollin McCraty, the Director of Research for HeartMath Institute, one of the great organizations, I think, in the world that for decades now have been plumbing the depths of the sacredness and the wonder of the human heart and how the simple beating of the heart in a coherent way can empower everything in our lives. And he's been thinking very deeply about intuition in relationship to the heart. So Rollin, I'd like to welcome you to Humanity Rising. People know you well, and just turn the program over to you to say whatever you'd like to say about the intuition of the heart. And when you're done, I'll circle back in and we'll dialogue for the balance of the time. But thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Jim. And
especially under current world circumstances.
Well, we need more. We need the heart more than ever right now, don't we?
Totally.
Yeah. In fact, I was recently invited. This is nothing to do with our topic here, but you might be interested to speak at a conference in India. It was quite an honor, actually. It was the first. It was called the Global Spirituality Mahotsav, I think is how they pronounce it, the festival. And this was sponsored by the government of India and hosted by the Heartfulness Institute, which is blow away what I found out about them. And this is the first conference of its kind since 1893, when it was held in Chicago in 1883, and it brought together the kind of the world's religious and spiritual leaders from around the world. And at that one, kind of the call to was to basically call for tolerance amongst the religions and spiritual traditions of the world, and basically get along a little bit better. I'm not sure it worked. So this is the first conference of its kind since then.
Fantastic.
So it was really awesome, and there were over 300 organizations involved and inputted into this thing. That so we had
extraordinary.
The leaders of the Sufis and the Islamics and the Catholic in his robes, and it was all there, and what's his name, the leader of TM, and on and on and on. And
I thought the Parliament of World Religions had been meeting consistently through the last century. No, well, this was a different initiative.
Yeah, this was the first of this kind of conference that brought them all together.
Gotcha.
And so it was a pretty cool honor to be invited to do a keynote speak at this thing. It was the biggest audience I've ever addressed. In person like this, over 40,000 people there, and another 20,000
people.
Yeah, it's hosted at the Heartfulness Institute, which has the largest meditation center in the world. And so there are 40,000 people.
I didn't even know about that.
I know it's wild. And anyway, one of the stars of the show, who's I think was a guy named Daji, who's the leader of the global heartfulness movement. And he basically he shared a couple of really cool things, but one was, it's not tolerance that we need, it's acceptance. But I thought that was exactly the right frequency.
Exactly. That's certainly what we need in Gaza.
Yeah, but the reason, why am I telling you this story? There was a reason that I started this that I've lost track of. Oh, I know. I ended my talk by saying that, well, all this science stuff I've been talking about basically says that it's time for love to go viral. And
Mm,
that's kind of become that got a pretty big ovation, that
mhm.
one statement. And but I think
Good for
that's
you.
actually what we really need right now more than anything is.
Totally, totally, totally. Well, good. Well, listen, let's dive in.
Okay, sorry about
Uh,
all my
and
rambling there, but
no, that's beautiful. It's wonderful. I'm delighted.
yeah,
I'm delighted. Because it's an indication that there's a lot of creativity and goodness out there. We just don't know about it.
yeah.
Here you go
Well,
to India and there's 40,000 people in the biggest meditation. I mean, in Asia, it's just at a different scale.
it's different scale, yeah, yeah. And then I learned, and so that was the Heartfulness Institute. That's also amazing in that it's a small city, and and in 2015 it was desert, and they've turned it into this lush. I mean, they're very much into soil regeneration, and I mean, they've literally turned a desert into. They literally have a rainforest there, with all the right plants and
Amazing.
rainforests. And there's 40 million heartfulness practitioners in the world. Who would have thought?
And it's called Heart Most
Heartfulness.
Heartfulness. It's just that's an organization.
Yeah, it's the Heartfulness Institute, and it's been around for a long time. And yeah, very, very
Hey,
similar
really
to the HeartMath principles, actually.
fantastic.
Yeah,
It's totally inspiring, man. It's
yeah,
stuff like
isn't it?
this that
Yeah.
exists. Yeah. Good for you. Good for
All
you.
right. So without further ado, I'll show my PowerPoint and get started on talking about intuition.
Cool. And then I'll circle back.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jim.
Rollin.
One more thing. Here we go. So God, I was on a Humanity Rising call a few months ago, and I made a comment about intuition, and Jim asked if I would come and talk about it. So I agreed to do that. So tell a little bit of a story here along with the science. So the intuitive heart is what I titled this, because I really do think of this as our inner GPS for really day-to-day navigation through life's challenges and finding creative solutions. And I'd like to just ask you or invite you all to maybe reflect back over the past few days, week, whatever time period, and just see if there's been a situation you might have been asked to do something, or you might have had an ambition or whatever to do something, but you had a deeper inner sense that maybe that wasn't the best choice. Okay, and just kind of ponder that a little bit. So we've all had those situations, and I think if we really look back, over maybe a longer period of time, we've clearly all had those, and where we chose not to follow that deeper inner prompting, and what the play out might have been for you in your life. Because at least for me, anyway, typically it hasn't been. I can't count how many times I've looked back and said, "Gosh, I wish I would have followed that inner feeling I had, that inner sense." And it can be two ways. I mean, it can also be, that we should do something and don't. Maybe we had not the most fulfilling conversation with somebody, and we said something that might have hurt their feelings, and we have that inner prompting that we should really call them or go see them and clean that up and apologize, but we just don't follow through on it. And then that relationship could be hurt, harmed for, in some case, years, in many cases. So I think this is a good kind of intro to what I'm really talking about today. And we kind of keep it simple. We can really talk about the head and the heart, those two in those dialogue. And I would go as far as here as saying that if we look globally, that the largest source of stress on the planet really is that lack of alignment between our deeper heart intelligence and the mind's ambitions and wants and things. So really what HeartMath is about is tools, techniques, and technologies that help us bridge that gap, if you will, or that lack of synchronization and alignment between our heart's intelligence and the mind. As it turns out, the mind's the big winner when we're able to do that. Well, as scientists, we like Einstein quotes, of course, and Einstein had a lot to say about intuition. This is one of my favorites of his on the topic. where he says the mind can proceed only so far upon what it knows and can prove. There comes a point where the mind takes a leap, call it intuition or what you will, and comes out on a higher plane of knowledge, but can never prove how it got there. I mean, Einstein talked a lot about this. And then he says, and this is really true of a lot of the really great scientists, but all great discoveries have involved such a leap. It's really the second part of this that I think is most meaningful, where he says, indeed, it's not the intellect, but intuition which advances humanity. Okay, so I think that's a great intro to really what I'm going to talk about. You know, and intuition is one of those topics that, you know, I remember I was at a conference. Well, it's pre-COVID. It doesn't matter where, but there were a number of speakers, and I was doing a talk on included intuition. And somebody in the audience said, "Well, I asked a speaker, you know, this morning about intuition. Is there a place for intuition in business?" And the speaker said, "No. There's no place for intuition in business." I have a little different perspective on it. I think there's certainly a place in business and really all areas of our life. And this particular story here, I think, makes that point. After we published some of the data that I'm going to show you here today on the electrophysiology of intuition, as we called it back then, I was contacted by the dean of the School of Entrepreneurship in Australia, university dean. And he basically told me that the story that they had been studying intuition in what they call repeat or serial entrepreneurs for many years. They have cohorts of them at MIT and Cambridge and these different places. They've been doing these studies for years, trying to understand what it is that makes them different. These guys that just have this knack for, you know, for repeatedly finding the right opportunity and knowing when to follow through on it. And what he told me was, he said that 80% of these characters, as he called them, in these repeat entrepreneurs, the number one commonality among them all is that they rely on intuition when making the final decision. Of course, they look at the spreadsheets and things, but when the rubber meets the road, it's really their intuition that they then rely on. So he was calling me up to say, can we do a study together to use your methods to look at the intuition and the way we were measuring it from the repeat entrepreneurs versus the risk avoidant crowd, you know, accountants and things like that. And we actually did follow through on that. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it was, so I think there's just making the point that the people who are really good at business, these repeat entrepreneurs, 80% of them rely on their intuition. Now, in our work, and of course many others, on this topic. So I'm going to suggest here that there are three basic types of intuition. And I found that it's helpful to kind of talk about this up front before we go into what I'm going to present later here today. And the first is called implicit knowledge or implicit learning sometimes. And this is the type of intuition that's almost always studied in academic circles when there's going to be research or discussions on intuition. And that's because it's safe. So an implicit knowledge or implicit learning, this has to do with things that we've learned and forgotten we learned, or maybe didn't even know we were learning them. You know, we're watching somebody do something, you know, but there's learning going on. So it's implicit, meaning we don't have conscious access to it. It's a subconscious type of memory in a way. And so the brain is doing basically pattern matching between current inputs and those implicit memories and finding the match. And there are many, many examples of this. And it's also related to what's called expert knowledge. Many examples, but a classic one is a nurse who's been around, you know, a while and got some years on the job and can walk into a patient's room and kind of just see something about that patient and says, well, this patient's in trouble. They're liable to code, you know, in the next few minutes, next hour. And the nurse standing next to her, who's newer to it, looks at her and says, how do you know that? And usually the first nurse says, well, I don't know. I just know it. Well, she's learned something about something she's seen or detecting there. So this is basically why it's safe, is because it's all about the brain accessing, you know, these forgotten memories. And it's an important aspect of intuition. I don't want to discount it, but the problem can also be that the current situation may not be an exact match to the past reference that it's accessing. So it can be wrong sometimes. Okay, so energetic sensitivity is the second type. Now, this type of intuition has to do with, let's say, our nervous system's capacity and ability to detect and respond in a meaningful way to external signals from the environment. Well, let's see. Okay, here's an example. I think Marilyn Slitz and Dean Radin did some experiments. If you've ever that showed this, if you feel like somebody's staring at you and you turn around, sure enough, somebody's staring at you. We're able to detect that. There are, I actually have a friend who can feel earthquakes coming before they occur. And we now know that we can measure changes in the Earth's magnetic environment prior to earthquakes. This is pretty well established. So our nervous systems learn to respond, know what that change feels like relative to earthquakes, for example. Empathy, I would also put in this category. From our work, we also know that when the heart beats, we radiate a measurable magnetic field. We can put a probe out here in space, a magnetometer, and measure that, and decode the information being carried by that field, and with about 75% accuracy, what somebody's inner emotional state is. So our emotions don't stop at the skin. We are literally broadcasting them, but then our other people's nervous systems can detect and respond to those fields, and so that's why I would put empathy in this category. So those are just a few examples of energetic sensitivity. And the third type, non-local intuition, I just haven't come up with a better name for it yet. And these are the type of intuitions that we can't explain away through the other two types. Usually has to do with something in the future or far away, that you can't explain through field interactions and these types of things. And many, many examples of non-local intuition. How many of you have had the experience, for example, somebody's name comes to mind that you haven't thought of in maybe years. Could have been a childhood friend or somebody you knew, at a job somewhere or something. And sure enough, usually within a few hours or a day or two, you get a letter from them or they call you or something like that. So we had that kind of getting that information out of the field. A lot of driving examples of non-local intuition as well. It could be a road we've gone down 100 times or 1,000 times before. We drive every day, but for some reason we slow down before we go over a hill or around a curve. And sure enough, there was a child running out into the street, or there was an ice slick or an accident or something that we hadn't slowed down. We might have been in trouble, but we never do that otherwise. So, and I could go on and on here. There are many, many examples of this. But another aspect of non-local intuition, what I would suggest is the most important, is that connection to, as you'll see here, what I would call our larger self or higher self, if you want to call it that. Now, one of the things that we have heard most from, or very often for many, many years now, of people who learned the HeartMath coherence practices, how to shift our physiology into that coherent state, who practice that over time, they often talk about their intuition, that it's just like noticeably different, like it's on steroids. And then the second thing they usually talk about is synchronicities become a way of life often. I've heard that so many times, and I can say that's certainly true for me. So we developed a kind of built on a protocol that Dean Radin first did up at IONS, just added a lot to it. So we're measuring, in this case, brain waves and electrocardiogram and skin conductance and some other measures that aren't that relevant here. And so it kind of looks like this. The person's got the electrodes on and they're looking at a computer screen. And let me just go to the next slide here. I'm going to kind of tell you the results before we get to showing them to you. What these experiments found was that sometimes, and it's about 80% if I put a number to it, if a future event is emotionally relevant, that's really important here, emotionally relevant, something we care about, something that's meaningful to us, the heart can produce a neural signal that pre-alerts you before the future event takes place. Okay? So I call this an intuitive intelligence that reacts faster than and bypasses the normal thought processes of, the slower middle tracks. So the way we did this through several different protocols. And this is the way this basically worked. Your person's at the computer screen, like you saw, and they press a button. And then you see 6 seconds of data, a blank screen, sorry, while we're recording the data. So the data's all been recorded now, the brainwave and heartbeats and skin conductance and so on. At that point, the computer then randomly selects a picture that it shows you. And the important point here is that no one can possibly know what this future picture is going to be. The computer doesn't even know yet. It's a true random process that selects this photograph. And these images are from the 2 opposite ends of what's called the effective emotional picture set. So these are images that have been well researched to evoke types of emotions and intensity of emotions. So on the one end, you've got snakes striking at the screen and bad guys with a knife at a woman's throat, pretty edgy kind of images that evoke a negative feeling or fear response. And the other end of that picture set, you've got things like nature scenes and flowers and bunnies and things like that. Okay. So after the data is recorded, then you get the randomly selected image, which is shown to you. And there's a lot of detail here to make sure there's no what's called sensory leakage. And this is all published for people that want all the gory details. I'm not going to go into that. Then you see the image, then the blank screen, and then you repeat this many times and do this with a lot of people. That's the basic kind of protocol there. All right, so here's part of what we found. I'll tell you, I'm not going to go into all the data in great detail here because you would get bored with all that. But here we're looking at the pink and green lines as the skin conductance. And where you see the little blue box, the picture display period, 0 is when the image came on the screen. And what we're interested here is the pre-stimulus period before you saw the photograph. And you see that the skin conductance, the blue and the green line, are basically the same thing before that. While the pink line is if the photograph was one of those negative emotional ones, we saw a big stress response in the skin conductance. This is the skin conductance data. And the green line is if it was a calm picture. I was like, oh, okay, breathe out. It's all good. But now when we look at the blue and the red line, this is the heart data, the HRV data, basically heart rate variability data. Well, let me just leave it at that. So what we see here, the red line, if the future picture is going to be a negative one, that there's a really big difference between the red and blue line. So the blue is if the future picture is a positive one and the red a negative one. So a highly significant difference in that pre-stimulus period. So the next step is that we were also looking at the EEG data, the brainwave data, and I'm not going to show you all the different maps and topographs that went along with that. But so now we're looking at that pre-stimulus period in terms of the heart rhythm, the HRV, and where the 2 curves starts to diverge. I think that we can make a pretty good case for that's where the heart had the information, wherever that comes from for now. Now we're looking at adding the blue line. And the blue line is it's called an evoked potential of the brain at the frontal cortex in this case. And the negative going voltage like that for this evoked potential is basically the brain saying to itself, I need to pay attention, something important might happen. I don't know what it is. Where it shifts and goes positive is the aha, something's here, something's arrived that I need to process. And then you've got the ongoing processing of it. Okay, so that's the classical interpretation of these evoked potentials. There is about a 1.5 second difference or delay in that period. Now, so what we did, and I'm not going to show this data because it's a little bit hard to make sense of in a presentation like this, but it's called heartbeat evoked potentials. And this is the technique that allows us to trace the flow of ascending information through the nervous system from the heart, how it comes up the vagus nerve and the spinal columns, goes up to the brain stem, and then goes to the different parts of the brain. So we can literally track it through how it's processed through the brain, both in time and by location. So you can actually see it go from here to here to here, all the way up to the frontal cortex. Okay, so we did that, and what we found was that in that 1.5 second period, right before that upward shift in the evoked potential, that the heart was sending a significantly different neural impulse or neural signal to the brain. during that 1.5 seconds, right before the evoked potential, the blue line shifted upwards. So basically, we were able to track and trace how the heart was sending the information to the brain, and then you see the brain response. Okay, then that was basically the flow of information. So what I'm saying here, heart first, then brain, then body. There's a little bit more to the story than I'm going into here. But then when you have the body response, the gut feeling or the hair on the back of the neck, gut gets the credit oftentimes because that's where we feel it. And that's when it becomes a conscious feeling. Okay, all this other stuff is typically unconscious. So that's the real flow of information. Heart, brain, body, and then if we're paying attention, a conscious feeling. Okay, so that was pretty cool findings, actually, obviously. Then we developed a second type of protocol to do these kinds of studies. And that the protocol I just shared has been replicated many times now, but then we developed a second protocol we called a gambling protocol roulette study. And so this is now looking at 13 people who did this protocol 8 times. They did it during half the time during new moons, the other time during full moons, just to see what would happen. And now in this case, we have 2 pre-stimulus periods to look at. You have the period where you place your bet, in this case, red or black, and then you have to wait and see what, you have sounds of a roulette wheel going around and the ball dropping, kind of make it fun, and then you get the answer. So that's also your second pre-stimulus period. And what we see again, even in this protocol, is in both pre-stimulus periods, we have a significant predictor of what the future outcome is going to be. Again, in the HRV, the heart again being the predictor, and the skin conductance not really showing any difference until after the results were known. And this has been repeated in both these protocols, like I said, a number of times independently by different groups with the same basic findings. All right, now here's one a more interesting one, replication. And this was done actually in Iran, long before Iran is the way it is now. Again, this was done in entrepreneurs, but they added a creative twist. They repeated our findings with a single person, but then they asked the question, well, what if we have 2 people doing the same experiment at the same time with the same images and the same pre-stimulus data? And here's what they found. That where they had pairs of people doing it, it was a significantly greater prediction of the future event, a greater separation of those 2 curves. So this is just kind of, I think, a neat way of showing that when we really come together in decision making or in our intuitive insights, that it really can amplify those outcomes, which is exactly what they showed here. Okay, so basically the way I got these results published in the first studies, this is back in the late 90s, late 90s, in peer-reviewed scientific journals, was what I basically said is it appears that the heart has access to a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space. Okay, perfectly acceptable language back then, and but at that time, because things like non-locality and entanglement had been experimentally proven in the quantum physics side of things, but it was only supposed to happen at subatomic scales at that time. Now that's no longer true. That's been those same effects have now been clearly shown in macroscopic objects and groups of atoms and so on. But the question that I would ask you to ponder here is, well, what is this field of information outside the boundaries of time and space, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that it's really what we would call heart intelligence. It's the energetic part of our wholeness that we access through what here at HeartMath we call the energetic heart. So what I'm just suggesting is we have the physical heart, but we also have an energetic heart. And I'm just saying that that's, from my perspective, very real, not a metaphor with its own real structure. It just exists in another dimension of density. And in fact, I would also go one step farther to say the energetic heart is what's talking to directly at all the DNA and all the cells. It's where the missing information is, really the blueprint for who we are and in our purpose and those types of things. And that the energetic heart is the bridge between our humanness, our existence in the earth domain and dimension, and whatever you want to call it, your higher self, your soul, your spirit. We here at HeartMath, we just call it our larger self. So that's the straight line to download that information from who we really are at our larger self through the energetic heart down into the cells and the mind brain system here on Earth. So that's why we call it your inner guidance system, when we're able to access that. Now, what I didn't tell you earlier about that series of experiments that I showed you is we had the participants in one of the studies, about 30 people go through it, come into the lab once, and we were very nice to them, get them hooked up, and which takes a lot of time, and go through this experiment. And then another time, and this was done in a counterbalanced way for the scientific minded, to do a few minutes of heart coherence, to get in that coherent heart rhythm before they did the experiment. And there was a dramatic difference in the outcome in those two different conditions with the same people. That communication channel that I was describing between the heart and brain was dramatically, I'll say, opened up. So we saw a much stronger and faster modulation, right, especially at the prefrontal cortex, of the information from the heart, if we were in that coherent state first. Okay, so basically heart intelligence is defined by the founder of HeartMath, Doc Childre. He says it like this: to picture heart intelligence as the flow of awareness, understanding, and intuitive guidance we experience when the mind and emotions are brought into coherent alignment with the heart. This intelligence steps down the power of love from universal source into our life's interactions in practical, approachable ways, which inform us of a straighter path to our fulfillment. I think that's a nice definition. Okay, so that's really, Jim, the end of what I was going to share. So we can. There you are.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, you're deep into research.
Well, that's what I do.
The data, man.
That is what we do.
Yeah. You mentioned, just so I'm clear, that this research that you're representing, that was begun back in the 1990s. So you started this about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so the data that you just shows, that's your latest kind of.
No, that was all done back then.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you've been basically building out the understanding of the data. So this isn't new data, but what you're doing is the meaning of the data for kind of ordinary life and spiritual development. Yeah, gotcha.
I mean, we published it, replicated it, helped others replicate it, and then so then we moved on to other topics, other things.
Well, let's go back to the different kinds of intuition, because I think that was very interesting. You have the non-local, and then the energetic, and then the implicit. And I would have thought, and this is my question, that for most people, we experience intuition as implicit. Right? You have a feeling about a person.
Yes, yeah, I do. And
Yeah.
I was probably rushed through that a little faster than I normally would, but trying to keep to our 20-minute time frame here. But
yeah.
But we have, everybody has access to all three types. It's not one or the other. Now, of course, and I'm sure you can relate, Jim, some people are more comfortable or centered in one than another, right? But really, we can, and if you don't have a lot of one, that can be trained and developed, right? So, like energetic sensitivity, we have some exercises where that becomes very clear that that's what's going on. It's called coherent communication. But we all have the capability or the capacity to have all three.
Right. It's just a matter.
All three is great. That's a good rounded, intuitive context.
Right. So the training programs that you have really enabled a practitioner to kind of suss out where they're strong and where they're weak in terms of their intuitive capacities, and actually train themselves to become more proficient in all three ways.
Yeah. Well, we especially, I would say in our training programs, I mean, you probably get all three, but we tend to focus more in training on the energetic sensitivity side and the non-local intuition, but especially in terms of accessing our own inner self, our own heart intelligence. I mean, to me, intuition is the flow of information from our larger self via the energetic heart down into to our conscious awareness.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk for a minute then about the relationship between coherence and intuition, because most people are just kind of going along in their day. They're not either thinking about coherence or getting out of the car. They're going into a shopping mall and then they just get this bad feeling. So intuition seems to be independent of whether our heart feels coherent enough, right?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
And it's broadcasting basically all the time as it's sensing the world through these three modalities. And the question is whether we're going to listen to it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, so the implicit, it's all brain, right? That has nothing to do with the heart so much, because we're constantly pattern analysis and subconsciously. And in the research world, academic research, this is called dual process theory. And that basically means that, this is, I'm talking about the implicit type now, that we have two channels by which we process information. One is the fast track, which the implicit, where we're rapidly comparing the input that we're getting now through the senses, what we hear, see, smell, and pattern matching it to these past implicit unconscious memories. And we get a match, there's the I know what to do, right? That's expert knowledge, same is why that's built on this. And there's another example, which is often called insight in the academic literature, where it's the same process, only it works slower, right? Have you ever had the thing where, Jim, where you encounter a problem and you just don't know how to solve it? You don't have the solution, and we, kind of wear ourselves out thinking about it, and we finally said, oh, the heck with it, and then usually a day or two later, we're in the shower or driving the car, and I'm thinking about it, and right? The insight pops in on either the answer or who to go talk to get an answer or something that helps move it forward.
But it was on the slow boat.
Well, yeah, but it's the same process. The brain's just been working away, trying to find those pattern matches to that potential thing, right?
Yeah.
And then so that's the fast track. Then the dual process theory. Then the slow part is where it becomes a conscious perception, awareness, and we're thinking about it, and kind of a conscious perception of it. That's all in that implicit box.
Gotcha. And there's all this data about how if you have an intention before you go to sleep and you just go into the sleep process, that often when you wake up the next morning, you'll have either an answer or some glimmer of connectivity with what your intention was before you went into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, sometimes it is through sleep and dreams that we get the answers. Especially if we set the intention, whichever of those three processes it is.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really matter.
Right. Now, for you personally, which of those three types is your strong suit?
Oh, a non-local.
Really?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've got both. I mean, I would say I have awareness on all three now, but non-local for sure. Like I made the comment that, and we hear this from so many people, Jim, that when they learn the heart coherence practices, how to self-regulate in, the stresses of life, that you can kind of think of as an inner prompter, kind of comes online. And so this happens to me all the time. And if I slow it down, it's kind of like, do you really want to respond that way? Do you make sure you read that email again before you push send? Right. And then you reread it and you go, I better not say it that way.
Yeah.
I was kind of reactive when I, wrote that.
Yeah.
Or it can be that kind of that inner voice of how to navigate social situations, or if you've got a difficult person that you're that you perceive as being difficult anyway, because they're not acting like you want them to. How to maybe handle the right thing to say at the right time. I mean, I can, for me,
Right.
if I'm writing, which I write a lot, research papers and so on, I'll get stuck every now, pretty often actually, if I'm honest. I'll just stop and kind of do a coherence exercise, get coherent, and just ask myself, ask my heart, well, any suggestions on how to say this or phrase this? And more times than not, I'll get a prompt, that'll get me started. But sometimes, it takes some time. You might be asking your higher self, your larger self, a question, and you can't expect a miracle that's always going to be right, like a bullhorn going on in there. Do this. Sometimes it might take a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
More times than not, it shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, Jim, I've learned to expect synchronicities. I mean, I kind of live my life that way.
Mm-hmm. Imagine.
Yeah, in fact, I was on a phone call early this morning with Roger Nelson. Roger, of course, and he was some experiment. We're sharing some data from the GCP2 project that we were doing, and we were talking about Roger. Well, have you ever heard of so and so? And he's wanting to get some of your data, and I'm saying, well, Roger, I sent him an email weeks ago, and while we were talking, I got an email from the guy.
Amazing.
That been weeks since I heard from him. I mean, now that's it, because is that a coincidence? Well, probably not from my perspective, because it just happens too often.
Right. Well, let's delve into that. What do you believe, based on your data and your experience, what's your sense about the connection between becoming coherent and synchronicity? What is the connectivity between those two?
Okay, well, that's a big question. All right, so probably the simplest way I can answer that is when we learn to manage our own coherence, and we practice that enough that it's become our new baseline. We're not trying to work at it. It's just our new natural state of being in a more coherent state, where it starts to feel uncomfortable to not be in that more balanced or coherent state, right? That's when the intuitive stuff I'm talking about becomes more natural online, kind of the way we're navigating life. We're not having to think about it, and it's just that input. So that would be the alignment between head and heart. So I kind of did a vertical line there, right? That integration. And then as that elevates our own physiological and mental emotional baseline, our ability to just be naturally more composed, kind of kinder, more compassionate, appreciative people, then we have what I'll call the horizontal plane, because now we're starting to literally and measurably broadcast more coherent signals in our energy field. Again, this is all measurable. I mean, this is not theory, because this is stuff we can measure. Then actually some of our current interest actually is synchronization, as you say, between people. Physiological synchronization. So there's a lot of, I'm sure you're well aware, Jim, of data that's showing that when people, especially if we like each other, and we unconsciously fall into a synchronization in terms of our vocal patterns and our body language and this kind of thing. And that's been known for years. And that the more that occurs, that's associated with pro-social behaviors, deeper listening, better understanding, that degree of synchronization. That for most people, it's unconscious that goes on. But then there's a deeper level of, I'll say, in this case, heart rhythm synchronization that we're looking at. And this is kind of a new territory. There's actually, it's kind of like coherence was 25 years ago. We were starting to talk about coherence and heart-brain coherence, and I'd go to conferences and people would look at me like, what planet are you from? What are you talking about? Right? I mean, literally. Now it's everywhere, right? I mean,
yeah.
So I think heart-to-heart synchronization between people and within groups is kind of like that now. We're publishing the first studies around it, and others are looking at it as well. And what the data suggests so far, Jim, is that, and I'm talking heart rhythms now being in sync, like maybe you and I are right now. I don't know, we could be measuring this. That's some of the studies that we're starting to do are within groups. That two things are important for if we're going to see that synchronization occur. And the first is that you have to like each other.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I'm literally, but there's a positive emotional connection. Like if you work with somebody and you say, I'll work with you, but I don't like you. You know, I ain't hanging out with you after work, forget it. We don't see synchronization. And then the second factor, not as important as the first, is then coherence. You know, how naturally coherent are people, or have they been practicing the coherence practices and exercises? That is certainly a factor. And so there's enough data already, not all from us, but different. I got a stack of about probably 24 inches high over there on one of my desks, just papers on physiological synchronization. But it's still just beginning. And it's already been clearly shown that the degree of physiological synchronization, whether it's heart or brain or different things, is related to prosocial behaviors, group performance, you know, these kinds of things that we care about. So the questions we're asking now is, if we facilitate people getting in sync through feedback, does that then facilitate the psychological safety and, you know, group performance and these types of things, and whatever that group or team is, you know, whether it's a sports team or a leadership team or a nursing group, you know, in a hospital, or these kinds of things. Now, I'm sorry, it's a long answer, but
no, go. This is very important.
Some really fascinating data that we are just getting ready to submit to a journal. It's going to delay a little bit because we're going to add another analysis to it. But so we did a study a few years ago now where it was called the International HRV, Heart Rate Variability Synchronization Study. So in this study, we had groups of 20 people in five groups of 20 people in 5 countries. Let's see, Lithuania, England, Saudi Arabia, New Zealand, and California.
Wow.
I don't think I left anybody out. Okay.
That's a diverse group of cultures.
Yeah. Well, and it happened to be where we also have our magnetometers for the global coherence monitoring system, or Earth monitoring system, measuring the Earth's magnetic environment. So they wore these devices. Actually have one laying over here. Look like this. That are high resolution heart rate variability recorders. So you put them on, electrodes, you know, that stick on your skin. So they wore these 24 hours a day for 15 days. So a lot of data, you know, well over 100 people, 24 hours a day for 2 weeks of HRV data. And so I'll give you the highlights of what we found. I mean, we were one of the things we were looking at was the synchronization that we have with the rhythms of the Earth, the magnetic rhythms, and how in sync or not we are. I'm not going to go into that now. In the middle of that study, we organized a time for all of the participants and all the groups around the world. I think it was noon Pacific time, that worked for everybody, to do a 15-minute heart coherence exercise together at the same time. And so we all did
but
that.
Having never met before, just
no, the people in the groups knew each other probably.
Yeah.
Not always, but in most cases that they knew each other. Exactly. I mean, it was just audio. I think we used Zoom, not Zoom back then. It was Skype. This is a little right before the rise of Zoom. It existed, but nobody was using it yet, at least in us. So we did this heart coherence exercise for 15 minutes. Now, I'm going to give the highlights and get to the story I want to tell you, that the current. So we looked at the synchronization. Well, first of all, we looked at how coherent were at the individual level were the people in the groups while they did the heart lock-in, that heart meditation for 15 minutes. So all significantly increased, which we would expect. Unexpected in a way was we looked at the heart rhythm synchronization amongst the 20 people in each group. Significantly increased during that exercise. And some it had a carryover effect for a while longer, some not. Then we looked at the synchronization with the Earth. And that 15-minute exercise of getting ourselves coherent within ourselves, not only did it increase the synchronization with the others in our local environment, but it also increased the synchronization with the rhythms in the Earth for the next 24 hours. So it had a 24-hour carryover of getting us in sync with the rhythms of the Earth. Okay, which is, I think most people intuitively get it's a good thing to be in sync with the fields we live in. But that's another story. We talk about that some other time if you want. But All right, so that was pretty cool. I think really important data. And we published that last year, that study. Now, the new analysis is looking at the synchronization amongst those group members in each of the 5 groups over the 2-week period. Okay. Not just during that, day-to-day level of analysis. Now, let me give you a little background here. Almost all of the physiological synchronization studies that have been done and published so far, that you do something to trigger or enable or invoke synchronization. We sing together, we play a game together, we're talking together. There's some dynamic to elicit it. In this analysis, we're not doing that. This is free running synchronization amongst the 20 people in each of the 5 groups over a 2-week period, right? So most synchronizations fairly short-lived. We're doing this task together or whatever. And I'm not even sure why we did it. Intuition that we should look at it is why we did it. And what we have found is that 2 of the groups have significant synchronization amongst the 20 group members over the 15 days. Now, remember, these are groups of 20 people who had volunteered to be in a study. They don't necessarily, they're not working together, they're not in a room together meditating or praying for 2 weeks. I mean, they're going about their normal lives. Okay. So in the 2 groups that we found significant synchronization, above and beyond what you could find by random chance, were the 2 groups that have high social connection amongst the group members. All the other groups that didn't find it, they didn't have that. They were people who didn't know each other, didn't hang out together. And the 2 groups that have it are the group in Saudi Arabia and the group in New Zealand.
Amazing.
So that's the only thing we can, and that's consistent with other studies and other findings, by the way.
And what constitutes synchronization?
Their heart rhythms are moving up and down together. They're in sync over the 2-week period, free running, to say that.
And even if they weren't in the same room, like
they weren't in the same
Santa
room,
Cruz,
they were
I'm
not
in
in the same
Washington,
room.
but if we have a positive affect and we're doing something together, our heart rate variability would start to sync up.
No, and they're not always exactly down up together.
Yeah.
Beyond chance is what I'm saying here.
Right.
So what this implies to me, I'm not going to put this in the paper because we're going for scientific reports for this, one of the Nature journals, that I'll publish the data, then talk about theory later, separate from that. I learned that a long time ago from Carl Friedman. But what I think this is supporting is the perspective that when we hang out together, we like each other, we form those positive connections, Jim, is that we are literally forming a group energetic field that connects us all non-locally, energetically, where information is shared amongst the group members. So you really see this like in the exceptional sports team, or orchestras, things where it just something magical happens, and like they're communicating on some unseen way, those kinds of examples. So to me, this is that group, another way of actually getting at that group feel. Now we can't measure that field directly, at least not yet, but I think this supports that perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, birds of a feather flock together.
Yeah.
There is a certain coherence that comes to positive affect and common intention. It would sort of stand to reason. It'd be almost predictable that they would start to align their psychosomatic processes.
And so this would be another example of non-local intuition. We're sharing from intuitive information. Now, what I didn't mention, it's worth, I think, also saying in the presentation I gave, is and this is actually in the data, is what we found, the pre-stimulus before you saw the picture or you got the results on the gambling thing, the magnitude of that pre-stimulus response is correlated to the magnitude of the post-stimulus response. Okay, now what this means is that the stuff we care about, that tunes us to the information of interest, right? So if you think about mothers as a great example of non-local intuition, that know their child or children or their child is in harm's way, or they're just doing something they shouldn't be doing, right? On the other side of town or the other side of the world. And I've asked this question to in many, probably thousands of people at conferences and things. So all the mom, almost every mother raises their hand. Yeah, I got this. I know this.
Yeah.
So what tunes us to the information in the global field, from my perspective, is who and what we care about, right? Moms care about their kids. What a miss it would be if moms were getting the information from however many billion kids there are out there right now. It'd be a miss, right? So it's who and what we care about that changes the resonance of our tuner, if you will, to the information that we want.
Well, one thinks of what's going on, for example, this is just taking it out to the next level, but what's going on in Gaza, one of the things that I've been struck about in terms of Gaza is the unanimity around the world of concern. You know, it's been a very long time since that level of unanimity has come together to just nurture in the invisible realms a suffering people.
Compassion and which is a hallmark of being to the shift energies that we're talking about.
Yeah. It's doing something to the earth energies. It's doing something to the zeitgeist in a very, very powerful way.
Yeah, it's to me, and I go out of my way, and HeartMath certainly goes out of our way to be anything political or polarized, but what an extreme play out of two sides that really hate each other. That's the driving force there for Hamas to do what they did to attack. We can't forget that they started, that with a pretty gruesome attack, and then to me, it's just a hate driving the response. That's kind of blinding, the compassion and other ways that it could be done. At the same time, as you say, it's evoking a level of compassion and concern that's probably never been seen before.
Yeah.
So
now, how does that play out? I mean, let's just dwell on that and say Gaza for a moment, because this is what's up for the world, like this week with all the final negotiations and so forth. You have global attention on one spot. You have polarization between the sides. You've got an intent emerging sort of from the outside in around a ceasefire and resolution. In your experience, just to extrapolate, how does intuition, heart math principles begin to play out in a complexity like Gaza?
Well, I think intuition probably is the only way through it.
To talk about that.
Well, in other words, because when we really go to that deeper intuition from our larger self, that it's operating in another dimension, right? Of that can help raise first of all, getting coherent and connecting with our larger self helps rise us above our biases, in our histories and because you really can't be, how do I say this coherently? Really connecting with our large is really raising the vibration of our consciousness. And as we get into a higher frequency, I'll just call it of consciousness, we truly can become co-creative in the world. I mean, in terms of, we talk about creation, I mean, literal creation, where our consciousness is interacting with and changing the physical world. And it's a built-in safety mechanism. You can't go through that eye of the needle into that vibration where we really can co-create. We can't take hate and judgment and biases through that eye of that needle.
Good point. Yes.
What a mess the world would be if you could, right? Yeah. Until we've done enough work to get into that higher vibration. It's a little bit off topic of what you're asking me, but
no, it's very relevant.
It's going to take enough, from my perspective, enough people. Well, you could look at it. Unfortunately, the evolution of consciousness is a very big deal. It's typically a very slow process. Many lifetimes to get this. But from one perspective, I think the things that we're seeing in the world playing out now is kind of a drop in what I would call a basic dignity frequency. That's global. I mean, not just the wars, but I mean, just all the stuff, the school shootings and just ordinary violence that, even 5 years ago, we just said, what? That's going on now. And, for many people, they have to kind of hit the bottom to finally try something different. I don't know if I'm making sense or not. I mean, you kind of have
you're
to hit the
making
wall
perfect sense. Yeah.
before we finally say, hey, I'm going to take a deeper look inside and make some changes, right? Well, it's just, to me, it's just playing out on a world level. Because what we've been doing, just coming from the mind, and ambitions and all that is well, it's what's playing out now. So when's it going to get bad enough that we finally wake up and say enough is enough? Right? I hope I'm making sense here.
Sure.
And that's when we can go to that deeper heart. I mean, and ultimately, I mean, it is going to take, from my perspective, Jim, an increase in consciousness.
Sure.
Now, that may not happen this generation in some of the players. If you just got your family blown up, or, it might take a generation or two, but we finally have to rise above the things that they did us wrong 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that mentality and that downward circle, downward spiral of, tit for tat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just I wanted to conclude, and thank you so much for your time, Rollin. Speak to us a little more about the relationship and power of bringing coherent breathing together with breathing with your heartbeat. Because I think that feels to me that if you can bring your breath in relationship with your heartbeat, that the coherence then becomes very, very holistic.
The first step in most of the HeartMath techniques is called heart focused breathing. Step one.
You're just listening to your heartbeat.
No, it's not. It's focusing your attention in the area of the heart, and then breathing a little slower and deeper than you normally would. Focus of attention in the area of the heart is an important part of that. Now, we used to tell people to breathe at a rhythm of 4 or 5 seconds on the in breath and 4 or 5 seconds on the out breath. Don't hold your breath, but an easy rhythm.
Yeah.
Now, there's a reason for that. And that is we literally have a resonant frequency inside our bodies between the heart, brain, and lungs. And that is a 10-second rhythm. So 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. We're now breathing with the body's natural resonant frequency, okay, which is the same as the coherence rhythm. So we can by breathing, we dropped that and said, just find a rhythm that's comfortable, because it kept people stuck in their head, trying to count and do stuff like that. So if we breathe at that rhythm, but with most people, if they go slower and deeper and then go to the next step, we'll naturally fall into the resonant frequency anyway. In fact, we're just doing a big data analysis of millions of records of heart coherence to sort out what the natural resonant coherent frequencies are. That's a different topic, but so that, okay, here's, all right, to really explain this, I got to go a bit into the physiology. So we have the nerves connecting the heart and brain. The vagus nerve is one of the main ones, but then also the sympathetic spinal tracts also can have both efferent and afferent pathways, up and down. In the vagus nerve, 90% of the neural fibers, and there are thousands of neural fibers in each of the 2 vagus nerves, 90% of them are taking information from the body to the brain. Only 10% is brain down. And so the 90% has been ignored for years. That's starting to change here in recent years. But it's true. Okay, so the vagus nerve connects the heart and brain, also goes to the lungs, okay, as the connection. So when we breathe in, take an in breath, there are mechanoreceptive neurons in the lungs that when they stretch, they increase their firing output. So they go up some of the fibers in the vagus to the brainstem, to the NTS. And they basically, think of it like a light dimmer, a rheostat. When the firing comes up to the brainstem, it basically turns down the flow of vagal or parasympathetic information to the heart, which slows heart rate. So when you breathe in, heart rate increases. You breathe out, you release that stretch on the neurons in the lungs, turn the rheostat back the other way, vagal flow is reconnected, heart rate goes down. So whatever our breathing rhythm is, we're modulating the heart rhythm at that frequency, that rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So we can just look at the heart rate data and know exactly what somebody's breathing frequency is and how deep they're breathing. Okay, through this modulation.
Oh.
Now, this is the way breathing techniques actually work, right? So we breathe slower and deeper, we're changing the rhythm of the heart. Then you've got vast amounts of neural information coming up from the heart to every area of the brain. So you're changing the input from the heart to the brain through the breathing, right? So grandma's wisdom, right? You know, your little kid falls down and, you know, they're screaming and crying. You pick them up and make sure they're not squirting blood out or something. And what's grandma say? Breathe, honey, breathe.
Yeah.
Because you intuitively know until they calm down,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to hear anything or be able to, you know, function. It's the same thing. So we're changing the input through breathing from the heart to the brain, which goes right to the amygdalas, by the way, one of the main centers. So the amygdala is monitoring the rhythms from the heart and looking for basically looking familiar or not familiar. That basically is informing the brain on how we feel. But I'm saying a lot of science in a very short, cryptic way.
No,
here,
it's very clear and very profound.
So then the second step in the HeartMath techniques is somewhere along going to be along the lines of, you know, try to, you know, not or attempt to recreate or to feel a positive feeling like appreciation or kindness, or because now when we bring that in on top of the breathing, now we're taking the system into a deeper level of coherence and starting to shift other systems like the hormonal system. Things starts to shift then.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's kind of a simple, then usually it's going to be something next after we've done that, that brings the system into a literally more synchronized state. There's measurably more synchronization between neural activity in the brain and the heart. You can measure that. So we've calmed the system down. We've opened that intuitive channel, like I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. Then next step is usually something along the lines, depending upon the technique, ask your heart or ask yourself what's a more efficient or a more appropriate answer or solution or action in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So now we're getting that, you know, so we've calmed down the noise, the mental and emotional noise in the system through the coherence, opened that channel. So now we can get a more informed answer from our larger self into the current situation.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's all so simple, Rollin. It's so simple. It's just about breathing. It's just about calming oneself down.
Well, yes,
it's really extraordinary.
But breathing techniques have been around for a very long time.
Yeah.
So if it was just about breathing, I mean, and breathing is powerful and an important first step in self-regulation. But I'd just say we need to go those extra steps.
Yeah. And the breathing coupled with the gratitude,
yeah.
feeling a positive affect is as essential as the breathing.
Yeah, you're right. Or
you can.
Yeah, right. And I would just
as
add,
well.
Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of people, if you're really triggered, you know, or you're in a trauma situation, you may not be able to go to gratitude or appreciation or compassion. That's okay. Breathe neutral.
Yeah.
Right. Neutralize you know, that's huge. Even just going that step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Especially in a stressed out world. Just calming oneself down so that the other emotions can begin to surface.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating stuff. You are on the cutting edge, my friend. It's a delight talking with you. Just a delight. The work of your mind.
Are you, you know, I've stopped getting the Humanity Rising emails every morning. I used to come in and click on them if I had time, and
well, make sure you get them.
And I complained about it, and then somebody started sending them again. I don't know what happened. Why I'm not getting them.
Every time there's a Zoom upgrade, the Zoom masterminds or algorithms will cut out a certain group of Humanity Rising.
I got to do a Zoom up. Yeah, because I watched a lot of them more mornings than not. I would tune in and see what you were up to.
Oh, well,
Uh,
thank you. Thank
yeah.
you. That's
But
very
are
meaningful.
you still, I know I was on one of the first speakers on Humanity Rising,
Yeah.
like in the first 5 or 10, something like that, if I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah. Yeah. Heart coherence. We started out with
So,
coherence
yeah.
breathing in our
So,
opening session.
yeah. Are you still opening the sessions with like a minute of heart focused breathing or heart
We
coherence or?
haven't done it recently because we've been coordinating with some TV production, and they consider coherent breathing at the beginning of a session dead time.
Well, okay.
But it's probably a good idea. It's probably a good idea. It's because it's so important. So important. My God, it's important. So thank you, Rollin. Thank you so much. So that'll bring us to a close, everyone. And by the way, next week, we're going to have 5 sessions on intuitive interspecies communication
Oh, cool.
from Winter Woolhorn in South Africa, who's an animal communicator, an animal whisperer for many different kinds of species. And she's developed a whole technique of using your intuition
Mhm.
to engage in interspecies communication.
Well,
So that's going to
awesome.
be all next week on Humanity
I'll try
Rising.
and I'll try and tune in this time. We have an event starting next week. That's our annual Global Coherence Initiative event, a live event in here in Santa Cruz. So I won't be able to come into all of them, but
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me. God, the guy, I'm sure he's passed many years ago when I lived down in Southern California. Fred Kimball was his name, who was an animal communicator,
Mm.
and we invited him over. I had groups we organized even back then. This had been in the '70s, or '80s anyway. Yeah,
Yeah.
'80s, mid '80s, and he would come do little talks to our group, and talk to the people's pets they'd bring, and a lot of really cool stuff came out of that.
It's a wonderful world, Roland. It's a wonderful, wonderful world, and you're part of it, and you've been just very inspiring. Thank you so much. Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
That'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You'll see the link to the after chat in the chat box, and then we'll see you next week for 5 days on intuitive interspecies communication. Thanks so much. Bye for now.